Oh, can you hear me tonight? I've got a new microphone here I'm trying out. Will somebody say something or cough? You hear me? All right, you can. Is the reception good with this microphone?
Sounds really good.
Oh, super. I got this at the thrift store yesterday.
That's
Yeah, I
awesome.
think it was $2, something like that. Man, you can find some great bargains in those stores. Goodwill stores sometimes, electronic components. I got a pile receiver with microphone inputs and everything else. I thought it was $80 was pretty high. And I told him so. I got it for 60. Well, that's more than I usually spend, but for this particular item, I would because the price of it was $300. So also, I bought some printers. What is that? One was $7 and the other was $12. They're over here in the corner someplace. There they are. Both of them are still sold. They're only 2 years old, both of them. They call it, they've got scanner on them, fax, the whole thing. No ink, of course. I brought them home, cleaned them up. So what did I pay? $19 for two. Well, they're really top of the line consumer printers. Yeah, the ink does, but if you buy ink from an alternative vendor, you don't have to buy the printer company's ink. You can get refurbished ink cartridges for, I don't know. Yeah. I love to get an Echo printer. And if I ever needed one, that's what I'm going to get. But I thought I would just fix these two up. They're just like new. Give them away to some organization that needs them. I'm just saying there must have been, in one of those stores, there must have been 10 printers or more, just with piles of dust on them and out of commission. So you plug them in and they worked. I guess it's just as economic for people to go buy a new printer today than find a good one and pay nothing for it. Hey, Jesse, if you can hear me, you're on to preach, not this Shabbat, but the next one. Cool.
Yep.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Are you aware of that? Okay.
I am.
Great,
Yes,
great. Let's see. Father, we thank you for this time together in this little meeting. We give you thanks and praise for the knowledge we're now going to pass around as each of us offers some knowledge from their own experience. And this particular subject, Father, sacrificing, it was such a stumbling block for me for so long and still is for many people. Well, I hope that we can clear a little bit of it up tonight by putting our heads together and coming up certainly with what your intention or their intention was with the sacrificing. Clear up some problems today within the movement. We thank you for that. We know you will. In Yahshua's name, amen. So do you know anything about that, Shelber? About why or if the sacrificial system was set up by Elohim, or was it something they all set up and just gave him the honor of it?
I mean, I don't know. I would say that you could see some elements that he was trying to teach us about himself as far as how set apart he is, but he
Oh, yeah.
used sacrificial elements. I mean, if that's man-made, then that's a huge coincidence, but uh, I would have to say it doesn't seem man-made to me.
Mm-hmm. I've run into Ebionites that definitely think that it shouldn't be in the scripture, that he didn't do that. He had no reason to do that. Of course, it leads to nullifying the atoning sacrifice. That was always my question, but I'm come to a place I think I understand the atoning sacrifice. And for me, it's probably the most important doctrine in our entire faith, outside of, the basic things. Oh, it was imposed on them. The GC incident. What is that? Type it up, if you would, Vicky. Gold. Oh, yeah. Apis or Apis. Apis. Yeah, I want to talk a little about that too. Apis. So I'm going to move over to my notes, and I'm going to ask you to please chime in anytime you have some insight in this, because this is one of those cases where the more you have, the better. And then at 9 o'clock or before, we'll break into our leadership meeting. We've got 4 different things or so to discuss on there that we just need to come up with an answer to immediately. So what you eating there, Gregory Smith?
I'm chewing gum.
Okay. It's a nice thing. You can chew gum. That means you have some teeth. I wanted to look at this from a perspective that I found in the Nazarene Acts. I don't know about you. If you ever read this book or maybe even heard of it, you probably heard of it. Let's see. I wonder if anybody here could give me a little text or something if you haven't. Yeah, new printer when they run out of ink. It's the same way, I'm sure, with these, because these are like brand new. All right. You asked for one. Did you get it? I think I sent it to you. I sent you something today or yesterday. All right. Well, it's an important book. It's the Clementine Recognitions, where it was. I changed the name of it primarily because the Clementine Recognitions don't tell you anything, or even worse, pseudo-Clementine Recognitions. Right there, you've got it labeled as a false writing, pseudepigraph, false writing. And this, as I mentioned before, when I first found this book, it only had like the first chapter in the text that I was looking at it. And I was so intrigued that I began to look. And this was back years ago. And so I had to go on a library look and try to find it someplace. And I found it in a little seminary's library, theological library in Tennessee. I couldn't find it any time else. Of course, this is right on the nib of the time when the internet was just beginning to become popular. Email was just getting popular. And I requested to borrow that book. It was in their, what do you call those books? They're books of worth. They put them in a little library and lock them up. Rare books. There you go. It's not rare anymore. And so I had to get the permission from a faculty member of a major university to get this book out of the library, which I did. I was living in Pensacola at that time. I tracked the guy down, an emeritus professor of some Christian thing at maybe the University of Florida. tracked him down, went to his house, and we talked about it. And he said, sure, I'll go ahead and vouch for you on this. So I got the book and I put it on the copy machine as fast as I could. Well, am I breaking the law there? No, because any copyright that would have been on this book expired in the 5th century or so. So it's expired. You know, you can take an expired book that was under copyright and you can actually sell copies of it if you think you can. And I noticed that my version of the Clementine recognitions and homilies has already been copied because I don't put a copyright on my stuff. I think my thought is as many as I can get out, the better, because it's not me that I'm trying to enrich, but the word of Elohim. And this book is so packed full of early information that there's just about anything you can think of that you can find in there. And it comes to the voice of Kefa. And scholars today are having a new renaissance with this book. They are finally coming around. Since about 1985, they started to come around on this book as far as the authenticity of the words and the acts in the book. And of course, starting with, well, one was Robert Eisenman, of course. He was about the second one to really pay attention to it. But when I read it, it was like coming alive. It was as good as or better than the canonical acts. I really thought it should be in there, except they can't find any originals for it. The earliest one they can find is 5th century. They're guessing. It could be 4th, 3rd, could be anywhere down there. But you know how scholars are, and whatever they say goes in the world of biblical literature. So what was I saying? Oh, I would like to get this out some more because I want to do a second volume of it this year. I want to get some more people to recognize what it is. And in order to do that, I'm willing to give out any number of copies of it. And so what I wanted to ask you, maybe you could be an agent of this. Maybe you have people you want to give them a little gift. They're interested in some types of literature or reading a story. This is really in a story form. It's a good story. It's probably all true too. In PDF, or it's printed too, from Lulu. You can get it in lulu.com. I use them to print. And, before something happens to me or I go away, I would like to see as many people get this in hand as possible. So if you know people that would like them, or if you've got a radio program or something, like so many do these days, or a YouTube channel, hey, give this as a gratis gift. Enough people have heard of it now that those that have probably would like to have one. And I've given out thousands of them free of charge. And it's for sale printed. I can't give those out because I have to pay for them. So there you have it. If you'll do that, if you've got something going, if you have friends or relatives that might be interested in the Hebrew life. What I did to this book is I got it out of the church pew. Re-Hebraicized it as it would have been in the first. And then got it out in ways, many ways that were cheap and people responded to. I have an audio book of it too. This thing's got 300 pages. The audio book has 4 hours more of stuff in it. Think about that. Maybe mention it in prayer. I'd love to see another 1,000 of them go. So before we get started, let me give you a quote from the Gospel of the Ebionites. You know who the Ebionites are? In the Acts of the Apostles, they're called the poor. Ebion means poor in Hebrew, I understand. The poor people, the poor of spirit, the plain old poor, the people who live on the other side of the railroad tracks. Listen to what the Ebionites say. This is in the mouth of Yahshua, I have come to abolish sacrifices. He comes right out and says it there. And if you do not stop sacrificing, the wrath will not cease from you. It's just good words to put in Yahshua's mouth, because he came at the time when Yahweh just decided to do away with this whole thing. He was not only the last sacrifice for sin, but he was also the last herald of the last sacrifice, the last gospelier, we might say, of the last sacrifice, the last word, the last warning. So I would certainly think that he would have said something like this or very similar. And it's not something that you would probably put in a canonical gospel, but it goes well in the Gospel of the Ebionites. But I would ask you, if the Ebionites come to you to try to convert you, stay away. Even if it's our former bishop of the Yahad, stay away. Because in becoming an Ebionite these days, and so many of our people have, honest to goodness, you eventually have to give up your satisfaction that Yahshua's sacrifice was the last. And you have to give up the idea that things are cleansed with blood. Everything in the scripture is cleansed with blood. Now, we don't want to get our hands bloody. We don't want to get too close to that. It would be nice for us just to put it all away. But we have to look at the entire plan to see what was going on at first with these sacrifices and what was going on at the end with those that did it getting rich as Croesus and not sacrificing anymore just to Yahweh Elohim, but rather to the gods of the Romans and the Greeks and the pigs. Now, let me take a look here. Oh, there we go. Isaiah 1, verse 10. You probably already thought about this. Yahshua says, by the voice of Yahweh, you rulers of Sodom. He's calling Jerusalem Sodom at this time through the mouth of Yahshua. Give ear to the teaching of our Elohim, you people of Gomorrah. A second insult. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says Yahweh. I have had enough of burnt offerings, of rams, and the fat of well-fed beasts. I don't delight in the blood of bulls or lambs or goats. Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. Your new moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations, I can't endure. Iniquity and solemn assembly, your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. This doesn't say anything about the institution of sacrifices, but it certainly says a lot for the people that were actually doing the sacrifices, because they're very much like today's religious people in that they pay lip service. They show up when the preacher calls or the bishop calls. They'll show up. They'll show up on the great pagan holidays of Christmas and Easter. Yes, they'll show up, but in their daily lives, there is no consistent witness whatsoever to either the goodness of Elohim or to their own holiness and righteousness. Now, how does the recognitions, that is the Nazarene Acts, respond to this? Well, first, if you don't know, the recognitions of Clement consists of a journal of the travels and speeches of Kefa, that is, Simeon or Simon Peter. Travel journal, and other early disciples of Messiah as well. They are recorded by the youth Clement of Rome. Forget the Clement of Alexandria thing. Clement of Rome, I guess he's purportedly the third pope after the first Pope Peter, according to them. Now, this young dude, Clement, now an orphan, was discovered by the prophet Barnabas in London. I think that was Rome, not London, in Rome. I should say that Clement discovered Barnabas. And Clement, even as the youth he was a cousin to the Flavians, because his name was Flavius Clemens. He was a cousin to the ruling house in Rome. And not only that, but his brother and his father are the ones that conquered and tore down Israel in 70 AD. So this guy was undoubtedly a believer, Clement, and he undoubtedly had a lot of problem with his relatives, because his relatives, Domitian, the emperor, did away with him in the 90s. They had him crucified or his head cut off. Why? Because he was an atheist. Oh, don't get me wrong. In those days, if you didn't worship the gods of the Romans, you were an atheist. If you were a believer in the Nazarene, you were an atheist. If you followed the religion of Heliogabalus, one of the later emperors, and a weird guy he was, then you were an atheist. Any religion that was not given the right foot of fellowship, the right hand of fellowship in the Roman pantheon, were atheists. So they killed him, really, when it comes right down to it, as a Christian. Clement, they finally got him. But there was some retribution here. Somebody finally got Domitian too. And it was Clement's wife, Domitilla, who was also Domitian's cousin. Well, anyway, let's get back to what's easy here. And when Clement got to Jerusalem, met Barnabas, Barnabas took him over to the headquarters to visit Yaakov HaZadik, James the Just, the brother and successor of Messiah Yahshua, and the then leader of his movement, the Assembly of Yahweh. This reading that I'm going to give you now is Kefa's explanation of why sacrificing was ever commanded or even permitted, and how the practice found its end. Kefa's answer, to give you a little of the rat out of the peck, was not unlike Yahshua's on the topic of divorce, which I'm sure you remember because probably 90% of us have been divorced at one time or another. Yahshua said in Matthew 19:8, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce. But from the beginning, it was not so. That answers the question about animal sacrifices just as well as it does about divorce. Where did the people in Egypt, the ancestors of the Israelites, learn worship from? Worship back in that day had nothing to do with standing or sitting in a congregational setting, raising hands and speaking in tongues or praying a prayer or singing. In fact, prior to the religion of Akhenaten, that being about 1350 BC, there's a number of strings between Akhenaten's religion, Atenism, and early biblical Judaism. In fact, in some ways, they are identical in many ways. If you'd ever studied this particular aspect, you would say so too. But the first time that we know of that people actually came into a place to worship was in Akhenaten. Let's see. Yeah, that was in southern Egypt, down by the Aswan Dam. And imagine, first time people came into a building. Before that, people outside were only told what worship was all about. And they knew when they were worshiping because there would be meat all over the place. Only the royals went to worship, and they were spectators. Atenism changed all this. Akhenaten built the largest temple ever in the whole world. Today, it's still there in its foundations in the city that was called Akhenaten. And if you're interested in that temple, you can find it. It's the Ezekiel temple. It's a so-called third temple in the book of Ezekiel. It's gigantic, and it's there. So Ezekiel was not talking about a third temple. He never says this was in Jerusalem or any other holy city. There's never been a temple built since the Akhenaten temple of such dimensions as we find in Ezekiel. And there it is. He built it. Akhenaten built it for the first time. Why was it so big? Because his idea was to bring all the people in to this temple to learn worship. Worship by psalms, worship by responsives, worship by music, but not worship by sacrifices. No sacrifices. When there would be a time of worship, usually on what we call the Sabbath, the people of Akhenaten, who were all undoubtedly Hebrews brought from the north down to there, when Akhenaten moved his capital, he had to get some people to live there. And the only ones he could get to go from northern Egypt were the Hebrews. And he liked them anyway because he was a monotheist and so were they. So this gigantic temple full of Hebrews worshiping the religion began to be formed. These people probably knew nothing about Moses. I'm off on the wrong subject here. Something I want to talk about is the Moses and what he was doing in Egypt. But anyway, I won't. I've got to get off of that. In the Egyptian temples, after Akhenaten, of course, was chased away and his city was destroyed by the priests of the gods of Amun and Apis. And Apis was the most important and highly regarded deity of ancient Egypt. And it was that bull. Remember the bull with the antenna on his head? Oh, I can show you real quick. No, that's me. I thought I can, but I don't know, my screen share doesn't work anymore. It just quit. I guess they thought it was so ridiculous that just forget it. It's the bull with a round antenna on his head. What's the round antenna? That's the Amun or the Aten. That's a sun disk. It wasn't worshipped, but Akhenaten used the sun disk as a symbol, a living symbol that people could see every day of the deity that always existed, and the one that he was worshiping, which couldn't be seen. So the original name of Apis was Api or Hapi. Nice name for a god, huh? Hapi? But Apis is the Greek name. The Israelites received all their lessons about sacrificing from Apis. And what are their sacrifices like? The only thing they did to worship was to kill animals. And the people were not allowed in there anyway, except to sneak around. People want to see what's going on behind closed doors. And so that's what they saw. The bull with the sun disk on its head, and everywhere they turned, there they were, statues of them, and still are today in Egypt. Okay, I've gone too far, but let's go back to Kefa in the Nazarene Acts, Recognitions, Book 1, Chapter 35. How did this all get started? Kefa's speaking here. Clement's taking it down. Those very Israelites, when Moshe stayed in the mount, made and worshipped a golden calf's head, after the fashion of Apis, whom they had seen worshipped in Egypt. And after so many and so great marvels that they had seen, were unable to cleanse. Let me read that again. And after so many and so great marvels that they had seen regarding Moses, they were unable to cleanse and wash out from themselves the defilements of old practice. The Israelites are so used to the worship in the form of sacrifice. I imagine outside of the temples they did it too. If they wanted to worship, that's what they knew as worship. It's the only kind of worship they knew or had practiced. Even Peter says that. But they couldn't conceive of worship without it. It had to be all relearned. And we would hope that, well, according to the records that we still have, this was taught in the temple at Akhenaten and continued on with Moses. During the time of Akhenaten, remember Joseph, what was his father's name? Yaakov? They were involved in that milieu. And I'm planning to go into that how next week at this time when we talk about the Jebusite hypothesis. Kefa continues on this account, leaving the short road that leads from Egypt to Judea, Moshe conducted them by an immense circuit of the desert, so that if he might be able, as we mentioned before, to shake off the evils of old practice by the change of a new education. Hey, that makes common sense. He didn't go the short way because he knew it would take a lot longer than that to get them where Yahweh wanted them. Just a second, please. But what's evident here from these words is that in the time of the desert, Moshe made great strides to eliminate that animal sacrifice from the practices of the Israelites, to even taking a slower way to their destination in order to have enough time to do it. Certainly, it was the Creator's plan to do away with this practice that Yah supposedly said was a sweet savor in his nostrils. I don't know where that came from. That sounds like a human being, especially a human being vastly fed on meat. He would have consulted with Moshe and laid down the value of tapering off over time. I went into a church for my first time, and this was a rural church. It was 3 churches, actually. There were 3 churches. I had to minister at all 3 of them, and I did so for 2 years. But I was also the piano player for these churches. They didn't have any, but they were good-sized churches. Yet there was no talent. It was so far back into the woods of Georgia that the only musicians you would expect to see were a guitarist and a banjo player, and neither one of them in very good shape. And they were using these hymn books from the 1920s in there. I know an awful lot of hymns, a lot. And I don't usually need a hymn book of any kind, but this, every time I opened the book, I had to get something new. I mean, the people there knew these hymns from the 20s, and that's all they knew. So I made a suggestion during one of the evening services when we did singing. I said, we really need to be more contemporaneous. We need a newer hymn book. We're desperately in need of a newer hymn book. I'd like to find that hymn book and teach you some hymns out of it. And then the leader of the church said, well, Brother Snyder, if you need a new hymn book, just leave it up to me. I'll take care of it. I said, no, let me take care of it. No, I'll take care of it for you. Don't worry about a thing. So about 2 weeks later, we had the same kind of meeting, and sure enough, boxes of new hymn books. But they were the same hymn book from the 20s. Now look, you can't just go into a congregation and change something like that. That's what I learned. If you're going to change anything, you're going to do it gradually. I tried to change one church to Hebrew ways. Didn't work. I ended up only being able to stay there for 6 months because I was going too fast. I couldn't stand the devils that were coming out after me. But the next one I did, I took 4 years laying the groundwork. And in a way, I hate to say it, in a way, I'm proud of it. But when it was my time to move, half the church left. Not because so much that I was moving. They left because they didn't want to go back to those dead lacks of discipline that the Torah gave them. Half the church left, maybe more than that. And the one they sent in was a 20-year-old girl to be the pastor of these old people. That didn't work either. So anyway, you can't just get in there and change something. If you want to be a pastor or you're in any organization, you go in and have the power to change something, and you do like that, you're going to have trouble. From the Recognitions, Book 1, Chapter 36, when meantime Moshe, that faithful and wise steward, perceived that the vice of sacrificing to idols had been deeply ingrained into the people from their association with Egypt, and that the root of this evil could not be extracted from them. He allowed them to sacrifice, but permitted it only to the Almighty, that by any means he might cut off one half of the deeply ingrained evil, leaving the other half to be corrected by another at a future time. There's some evidence that Moshe did take this kind of attack, seeing as how when he got to the Jordan the second time, there were only younger people there. The younger people in charge who had not, in the last 40 years, been in Egypt, didn't know these things, at least not so much as to be deeply ingrained with evil. Continuing to be corrected by him, namely the one of whom he himself said, a prophet will the Almighty, your Elohim, raise unto you, whom you will hear even as you hear me. Listen to all the things he will say to you. Whoever will not hear that prophet, his spirit will be cut off from his people. I think Peter's got him just right. Now, who's that prophet? Contextually, I think he's talking about Yahshua. Yahshua bar Nun, or Yahushua bar Nun, the guy with the book in the Bible named after him, Joshua. So Moses allows limited sacrificing since the people know no other way of worship, eventually eliminating part of the problem, leaving the rest of the amelioration to his successor prophet, the one who will come after me. But later, this same text is appropriated to refer to Yahshua bar Yosef, Yahshua HaMashiach. The text is appropriated, just like the one is about Wonderful Counselor, Almighty God, Everlasting whatever. If they would translate that rightly, we might not be so quick to say that that is speaking of Jesus. So I'm thinking that later the text was appropriated to refer to Yahshua bar Yosef, who will do away with the sacrificial system entirely. When he comes, he picks up Moses' job there in ameliorating the whole thing to end it. And this section then is ended with a warning. Oh, by the way, there's no reason this can't be accounted for by the history of Yahshua HaMashiach. I have no doubt that this is a double meaning, because when they got to the promised land, who was in charge? Yahshua bar Nun, son of the fish. Now we go to Recognitions, Book 1, and we're coming down to the last 15 minutes here. Chapter 37. If you or anyone wants one of these books, let me know. I shall send it. In addition to these things, he also appointed a place that was lawful for them to sacrifice. This is Kefa speaking again. And all this was arranged with this view, that when the fitting time should come, and they should learn by means of Yahshua that the Almighty desires mercy and not sacrifice, maybe both the Yahshuas, and they might see him who should teach them to the place chosen by the Almighty in his wisdom, where it was suitable that victims should be offered. On the other hand, so they might hear that this place, chosen for a time, often harassed by hostile invasions and plundering, was at last to be wholly destroyed. Actually, by Clement's uncle and his cousin. In order to impress this upon them, he continues, even before the coming of Yahshua, who was to reject at once sacrificing, and rejected this place. Think of it. Next time somebody says Jesus was in the temple, he wouldn't go in that temple. Kefa says he was rejecting the sacrificing and the place. Yeah, he hangs around the temple. I mean, he hangs around on the outside, like on the steps of the temple or in Solomon's porch. They wouldn't let him in the temple. He wasn't even on the same calendar as them, but he appropriated it so he could go preach to the minions of the lost in Jerusalem, the most evil city on the face of the earth, the whore of Babylon, which was often plundered by enemies and burnt with fire, and the people carried away into captivity among foreign tribes, and then brought back when they appropriated the mercy of the Almighty, that by these things they might be driven away and delivered in the hands of the enemy. But they who do mercy and righteousness without sacrificing may be freed from captivity and restored to their native land. Oh my goodness, does he know what he's talking about here? Because right after his life was over, millions had been killed. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, had been sent off into captivity. But very few at this time understood this. Nobody understands it now because the mystery is history. And Kefa continues, for the greater number, though they could perceive and observe these things, yet were held by the vulgar, irrational opinions. For right opinion with liberty is the exclusive right of but a few. There's a quote that should be in the Patriot Post. The ancient Israelites, though they were told to cease offering, cease sacrificing, cease worshiping, were unable to do this with conviction. Could you? Suppose the leader of your worship assembly, a venerable, successful, and famous minister, announced that your new method of worship was coming and that your old method of worship was no longer valid. He says, from now on, you are to bow before your God, which is the life-size statue of a crucified man. A man is made a god. Contrary to common sense and contrary to the scripture. To you, this would in no way resemble your lifelong practice of worship. And you would be very reticent to do it, and you just wouldn't do it, knowing you guys, as hard-headed as you are, this is not how or what we worship. You, the Nazarene, would say before you and many others rebelled against this new method. But the majority did not rebel. Then your God would no longer receive the food he needed to work on behalf of the people. Whoever's behind that upside down crucified man that we're worshiping. Now, this situation is very similar to what the Israelites were experiencing way back in those days, the Moses days. There had to be a compromise before the people could eventually grow to religious maturity, else they would have simply rebelled. And it seems like with the last 3,000 plus years of history, we just know that Elohim does not work that way. He doesn't crack a whip, but he warns. And then finally, the day of retribution comes. Book 1, chapter 38, Kefa continues. Moses then, having arranged these things, something in my tooth, and having set Yahshua over the people to bring them to the land of their fathers, went up to a certain mountain and there died. That such was the manner of his death, that till this day no one's found his burial place. Hey, have we heard anything about finding Moses' burial place in Biblical Archaeology Review? Or the magazine Archaeology? Or in the Encyclopedia Britannica? Where was Moses buried? Did he really die up there in a mountain? Is that just made up? I don't know. What do you think? When the people reached their father's land by the providence of the Almighty, Kefa says, for some time thereafter, they were ruled not by kings, but by judges, shoftim, and remained in a somewhat peaceful condition under the shoftim. But when they sought for themselves tyrants rather than kings, and with regal ambition erected a temple in the place of that which had appointed to them for prayer, and afterwards, through a succession of immoral despots, the people fell away to greater and greater and still greater impiety. So says Kefa, who's really saying a lot. With compromises on a command from the Almighty came a rash of foolish decisions by the Israelites. Horrible decisions. Decisions reminiscent of President Biden. Down the slippery slope they went with many tragic calamities. Was this Moses' fault for compromising on sacrifices and failing to institute modern worship? I think probably Dothan would say yes. Or was the slide the fault of the Almighty for not at that time lending his supernal power to the reformation of worship, the whip of God? This is not what he does. I'm not going to get through this, but I'll get as far as I can. Probably one more. Thank you for being so quiet and for at least pretending that you're enjoying this. Book 1, chapter 39, Kefa again. But when the time began to draw near, that what was lacking in Moses' institution should be supplied, and the prophet should appear, of whom he had foretold by the Almighty that he should warn them to cease sacrificing, lest they suppose without sacrifice there was no remission of their sins. Listen, this is important. Lest they suppose without a sacrifice there was no remission of their sins. I think that's one reason a religious person would be so hard to turn into an atheist. What about their sins? Certainly, Yom Kippur doesn't do anything for our sins. Maybe never did. But it's not instituted anymore. If Yahshua was proven to never exist, what will we do about that? I just read one of, what's his name? Oh, who's the popular professor at University of North Carolina, getting so much attention? Ehrman. Did Jesus ever exist? Was his book. Oh, I found that too, including a lot more great books to sell at the thrift shops. Yeah, my bookstore is still running. What is it, 5 years? He says that he proves that Yahshua did exist. And he's got all the proofs in this book. Simple to read, very simple. And he takes on, look, Ehrman is an agnostic. He's not going to say whether he believes or not. But he did take on the atheists in this book. And honestly, I've received questions all the time about Jesus not existing, or somebody trying to follow me up in the history. Did they show me something in history like, who's the guy from Tiana? I can't remember names very much anymore. Apollonius? Was Paul, or was Jesus, wasn't he Apollonius of Tiana? No, that's a fake Paul and fake Jesus of a man that may or may not ever have lived. There's not enough evidence that he lived to prove that anybody else lived. So, lest they suppose without sacrifice there was no remission of their sins, he instituted the mikvah to them, in which they might be absolved from all their sins, invoking his name and following a perfect life, abiding in immortality, being purified not by the blood of beasts, but by the wisdom of the Almighty, which in fact was Yahshua himself. An evident proof of this great mystery is supplied, says Kefa, that everyone who is baptized in his name, believing in the words of this prophet who has been foretold by Moshe, will be kept unhurt from the destruction of war that hangs over the unbelieving tribe and the place itself. But those who don't believe will be made exiles from their place and kingdom, and even against their will, they may understand and obey the will of the Almighty. So we turn back to history again. Soon before the armies were surrounding Jerusalem, the Roman armies that were going to destroy that, the Nazarenes there remembered the prophecy of Yahshua. And they left. They got out when they could, and they lived in caves over by Pella in Perea, halfway to Damascus. Must have been a hard trip to make, and living in those caves must have been hard because the people of Pella hated Jews. But they did it, and when they came back afterwards, several years afterwards, they took up their station again in Jerusalem and formed the Jerusalem See. That is, in the Catholic Church, they have sees, like the See of Rome, the See of Philadelphia, etc. the Jerusalem Sea, which you may be hearing a little about here pretty soon, set up the continuation of Nazarene worship there in the tomb of David, in the place where they say, hold on here, in the place that they call the tomb of David yet today, set up again after the war, and they were left alone until the line went away. The line of Yahshua and James went away. Now, why was James given the task of being the new messianic substitute or the head of the assembly? Because he was married, says Paul, and could have children. Yahshua had no children, and so the hereditary seat and seed could be passed on through James and his people. And reading in Eusebius, I don't know how many, maybe 12 or more of the Desposinai, the people related to Yahshua, continued on. I should have let you know just exactly how to find that, but some of the times these things come up. So let me read the last little comment I have, and we'll go to the meeting. From then on, mikvah, or better, what we call baptism. There's a good Hebrew word for this, and I'm not remembering it right now. I haven't had enough heroin today. Gave compliant people the assurance that their sins were indeed forgiven, that they hadn't lost a miraculous privilege when they ceased shedding innocent blood in exchange for the Almighty's atoning power. The rite of baptism was quite different then than now. Different as night as day. We have baptisms now when the preacher can arrange them, and then we never see the baptized again. That's the way it is today. Before the immersion, 3 days of fasting and prayer were required before the ministry of demon deliverance, including the demons acquired from the unclean meats they formerly consumed. Do people actually feel any assurance today of being baptized? Hey, it wasn't so easy to get in those old days. In our day, it's a simple matter to get out. Nothing is required besides a little sprinkle or a dunk and a pathetically weak promise that's seldom held seriously by anybody. And that's far enough today. I'm missing a little more, but you get the idea. I think that this is such a good explanation. I like to pass it around. And again, where is that in the Nazarene Acts? It's in book 1, chapter 35. Now, though, if you've ever looked at this, the chapters are very short. Chapter 35 is very easy to find, and Kefa from 1 to 35 goes through all the different arrangements in the Nazarene faith there that you should know already. But that book, it's got 10 books in it, and sometimes the chapters go up over 100. It's a handbook of methodology and grace. Amen. Well, thank you for coming out tonight and listening. We're going to have our meeting now. And in 2 minutes, I'll go off for 2 minutes and come back on. And if you should be here, then be here. If you want to be here, you're welcome to be here. Nobody's kicked off. Stay and listen. You'll probably enjoy what you're going to hear. Okay, Kenneth, give me 2 minutes. Thank you.
Hey, how's everyone doing tonight?
Doing good.
It's good.
Hello.
To see everyone here. Got a lot of people here for an executive council meeting. That's good. I spent part of my day reconditioning an old PC. Finally got it up and running. I'm using it right now. Jesse, black holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the conspiracy, the history, the meaning, the truth. What do you think about that book? Give us a synopsis. What's his argument there, Jesse? Nice links of Akhenaten and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Akhenaten is reputedly the leader in Egypt that converted everyone over to one god. Reputedly, there was a group of Essenes that were in Egypt.
Yeah, they actually the book. I know that's one source, but there's a lot of sources that say that if you remember Joseph, when he was in Egypt, even in the biblical text, it says that he became a father to Joseph. Or I mean, Joseph became a father to him. And they're saying that Pharaoh of Egypt that Joseph was under became Akhenaten. And that's all the people from Goshen were then put underneath him and Joseph. Does that make sense what I said?
Interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of the temple scroll or the copper scroll in Egypt has ties to Egypt. That's the copper scroll. If you know, the Essenes that were in Qumran had nothing to do with the Jerusalem temple. They would always revere the temple that Akhenaten had put up. And he also goes in to show how the exact measurements in the Ezekiel portions of the temple, everyone thinks that's the third temple in Ezekiel, that some future temple. It's actually looking back to the temple that Akhenaten built for the people of Goshen. That's basically it's a really good book. Actually, Jackson turned me on to that like a couple years ago, and I still reference it a lot. Good stuff. But there's another guy too. He's like an Egyptian guy. He's really big on this stuff. And I know a couple years ago, Jackson did a bunch of stuff on this. Some of it sticks, some of it don't. But interesting. But yeah, that's some of the stuff Jackson was mentioning tonight. That's where you're gonna find a lot of that.
Of course. Allison Gary did about 6 on that, 6 hours worth on that guy you're talking about. I can't remember his name anymore either, the Egyptian guy. Very convincing, but that little book, Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, everybody that's interested in Essenism needs to read that, because our faith doesn't necessarily go back to Moses. And it's not how he says it, it's what he says. He's got the evidence there about the name Joseph and Saphanath Paneah. And he's got the faces of the mummies and the genealogy. It's easy to read, it's short, and it's worth the $2 for a used copy, really. or let me know. I've got a PDF here someplace. All right, thank you. And if you're going to stay